All financial support for this podcast comes from my patrons on patreon.com. If you'd like to join in with the patrons, please check out patreon.com/DarwinGrosse. That's DarwinGrosse. Now enjoy the podcast. Okay, today I have the great opportunity to talk to someone I got to know recently, but whose work I've followed for quite a while. His name's Joshua Hodge, and he's the mastermind behind the site, theaudioprogrammer.com. If you go over there, you'll see that there's a lot of interesting stuff, from audio programming meetups to a set of courses that Joshua's been putting together, as well as links to a bunch of YouTube stuff. There's a lot of interesting information there. It's also, the site is kind of growing in its reach and what it's trying to do. So I thought it'd be a great opportunity to meet with Joshua and find out a little bit more. So with no more ado, let's say hi to Joshua. Hey, Josh, how's it going?
I'm great. Thank you very much for having me on the podcast.
Yeah, well, thanks a lot for taking the time. You seem to be a busy cat, so I'm glad that we were able to pull together the time to do this.
Yes, thank you very much.
So why don't we start off by having you give your kind of elevator pitch on what you're doing with theaudioprogrammer.com.
Yeah, so we started in 2017, and it started off very simply with me trying to teach myself how to develop audio apps and plugins while I was still at university. So I went to Goldsmiths University from 2015 to 2018. And so what happened was, it started off with these YouTube tutorials that I was giving, mostly using the Juice framework and C++. And the idea was really to teach myself how to develop these apps and to hopefully get a job after I graduated. And so I did the YouTube channel as a way for me to kind of keep myself disciplined, to actually learn a new skill every week that I could teach to somebody else. But it surprisingly grew into this thing that became a community, and people started asking each other questions. And eventually I created a Discord room for people to ask each other questions. And it started just snowballing into this big community. And now it's one of the largest audio developer communities on the web. And we have three main areas that we work in. So our core is our community. So we do the tutorials, we do audio programmer meetups. We also interface with the Audio Developer Conference, ADC. And then we have two other business sides that spring forth from the community side. So we have a development side where we actually help clients to develop audio plugins and products from start to finish. And we have a recruitment side. So we do both temp and permanent recruitment placements for developers with a number of companies.
Very interesting. Right. That's, it's a pretty big growth curve for just a couple of years. That's pretty wild. So I'm curious, you said that you started this off hoping to learn C++ and audio programming to get a gig. Did it work?
Yeah, definitely. Well, this has kind of become my gig. And it's funny because the other day somebody asked me if I actually develop for a living, which is actually an interesting kind of question, because I do, in a way, because I still do tutorials in C++ and I still try to code every day. But in a sense, I don't, because I don't actually code for a company. Well, I have my own application that I'm working on at the moment, but in the kind of truest sense, I don't actually develop for a company, but
sure.
I'm more of a manager / facilitator.
Right. That's pretty interesting. Now, I kind of took a peek at some of the YouTube videos that you're doing, and your series are pretty interesting in that you have one that's really kind of traditional, working with Juice, learning the Pro Juicer and all that kind of stuff. But there's also this kind of spin-off of learning C++, and it's kind of like, I'm going to teach my son how to use switch statements and stuff like this, right? It's really kind of interesting, but it's a unique approach, and one that I think, I don't know, it strikes me as pretty smart, because audio programming is It's kind of sexy, right? It's kind of fun. It has a certain fun level built into just the discussion, but it's pretty significant programming tasks. And so I think that it's kind of a neat area to work on. From your perspective, how hard was it to dive into audio programming from wherever you were coming from?
For me, there were definitely significant challenges because there's this intersection that audio programming comes into where you have, of course, the programming aspect of it. You have audio, and then from there it really branches out, and it's impossible to be an expert in all areas. So some people, they specialize in spatial audio, some people specialize more in synthesis and digital signal processing and that side of things. I chose to go more towards the DJing side because I come from a DJing and music production background, so I knew quite a bit about DJing applications and plugins and that side of things, but I wasn't so interested in the synthesis aspect. And so that's the challenge of being an audio programmer, I think, is that everybody is coming from their own experience. And I think that it's important to have some level of experience with interfacing with creating music or being a musician or coming. It's very tough to say, I have no experience with music, but I'm going to be an audio software developer. You have to have something that you spring from.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Because that experience level, it's sort of the foundation of not only why you get into it, but what you end up pursuing, right?
Yeah. There are so many challenges, and even in teaching, there could be a lot of challenges that you have to really make a certain amount of assumptions in terms of what the level of experience of the person that's watching the tutorial is going to have. Because if you try to cover every single aspect, the DSP aspect, the mathematical aspect, the programming aspect, then the tutorials would end up being, 2 or 3 hours long. But I would say that a lot of the challenges that I see for people, especially if you're starting off with using a framework like Juice, tend to be programming related. So it really stems from there. Once you have a solid programming foundation and you have a good understanding of C++, then you can move to the next level, which is trying to read the API and really trying to understand how to actually instantiate objects and how classes are meant to be used. And then you can move into kind of the audio DSP realm and start using that and putting that together with your programming knowledge to actually start building things. But when you don't have the programming background, it can be very tough to get started.
In a way, programming has kind of gotten to be normalized in for artists to kind of cross over and get involved in programming. But there is an awful lot of like engineering concepts that are endemic. Once you get beyond a certain level of complexity, there's kind of this engineering understanding that it needs to exist as well. How hard is it for you to communicate that to people who maybe are coming from a more artistic perspective?
I find that that's actually my favorite part, the explaining the engineering aspect that I really enjoy conveying to others, because the big thing that people don't understand, or I think the big thing that a lot of teachers don't really convey, is the why are you doing this, or what is the reasoning behind you doing things this way versus another way. I think that there are definitely certain challenges when it comes to C++ in particular, that for musicians, because really musicians, they just want to make some sound, don't they? They want to get to the creative aspect, and the quicker that we can get people into the creative aspect and getting them using their creativity, the better. And I think that C++ certainly presents a certain threshold, a pretty high threshold for doing that. You have to, it's tough to get away from the engineering aspect and getting into the creativity aspect. And that's why I think it was actually kind of a blessing to be going to a university such as Goldsmiths, because they really took us away kind of from the engineering aspect, and they really just kind of threw us in there and they said, just here are the basics. Don't be afraid to make mistakes, and just, feel free to just throw things around and just see what happens. And I think that was very helpful. And that's what I try to teach other people as well, because I think there's a culture in C++ where people try to be very careful and think about the most efficient way to do things and about the quote unquote right way to do things. Whereas what I try to do is I really try to say, when people come to me with questions and they say, well, what about this or what about that? I say, well, try it. Try it and see if it works. And if it doesn't work, then move to the next step. But I think that maybe wrongly there's been this culture created of, no, that's not the right way to do it. You need to do it this way, or you need to do it that way. I mean, I've seen code of products that have been pretty successful commercially, and the code looks absolutely atrocious. It looks absolutely terrible. And so I think sometimes we get a little bit caught up in the aesthetic of the code,
right.
But we get a little bit away from what the bottom line is that we want to create something that people are going to use and people are going to enjoy.
That's a cool perspective. I want to come back to that in a minute, but before we go there, you talk about Goldsmith, and it's clear that was really a influential place for you to go. But I'm kind of curious, in order to do the things you're doing, you have to you sort of have to balance a lot of things. And you kind of dropped a few hints at where you're coming from, having kind of a DJing interest background and stuff like that. But also going to Goldsmith, you're having to balance this thing of sort of like an artistic approach to the world as well as an engineering-like approach. But also you have to, because of what you're doing, you also have to have sort of a teacher's vision of the world too, right? You have to be able to kind of approach things from that perspective as well. I'm curious a little bit about your background. How did you come to sort of like have this breadth of capabilities and interests and willingness to pursue these different kinds of adventure all simultaneously? Where are you coming from, man?
Yeah, well, I think it all stems from, I think, my want and my need, my drive to help others. That's really where everything originates from. So I grew up pretty rough in a very dysfunctional home, very dysfunctional family. Even as a teenager, I was really thinking about counseling and helping others and teaching others. And then from there, I actually did that in a professional capacity for the Air Force. So I actually enlisted in the U.S. Air Force, and I was working in mental health and as a mental health technician. From there, I was doing that, but I was also very fascinated by music and by DJ culture and hip hop culture. And I was doing DJing as a second job. So I would do my day job for the Air Force, working on a inpatient psychiatric ward, and then I'd come back, and then I would use all of my paycheck on buying vinyl and going home and DJing and just practicing until I fell asleep. No TV or anything in my apartment, just DJing and working. So everything kind of stemmed from there. Then when my contract with the Air Force was up, I ended up DJing and then eventually producing music for a living for about 12 years. And that was really amazing because I got to travel throughout the world for my DJing. So I've toured throughout about 25 countries throughout the world DJing. And that was very fascinating because that really gave me a love of other cultures and other perspectives. But as many people know, sometimes, the music industry can go up and down, and there's no stability or very little stability in it. And so what I decided to do was I had some money left over from my Air Force time it's called the Montgomery GI Bill. That allowed me to go to university. And that's where I used that money. And I thought, what am I going to do with my life from now? I've DJ'd, I've done mental health. I didn't really want to do mental health anymore in the strictest sense. So I had this money that was left over if I wanted to go to university. And I'd never written a line of code in my life. And this was in 2015. And I just thought, I think I typed in music computing or audio computing, something like that, and I thought computing, that sounds like a legitimate way to make a living. Audio is something I know about. And it never occurred to me, hey, maybe make audio products, maybe make plugins. And so it threw me into this world that I'd never experienced before. Going to Goldsmiths and experiencing the things that I saw there, and meeting some of my professors like Rebecca Feebrink, who's one of the world's foremost experts in machine learning, Mick Grierson, people like that had a very strong influence on me. I just thought, how is it that the whole world doesn't know about this? So that's really where I just thought these people should just be like household names. That's the way that I felt. They're like superstars to me. And that wasn't really where the original vision for the audio programmer came from. That was just something that I kind of thought about along the way. But as I progressed along, I just thought, I really want to just try to shine a light on other people and like this amazing work that these other people are doing. And I think that eventually just kind of fit into the other things that the audio programmer was doing and how it kind of manifested itself eventually.
Sure. That's really interesting. Now, what did you study at Goldsmith?
So the course was music computing.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's that was divided between the computing department and the music department.
Interesting. Yeah, they're like notorious, at least in my end of the world, as sort of like doing a fabulous job of knitting the two together, because they're sort of uncomfortable cousins, I guess. They're both very much technology oriented, but again, one side tends to be very engineering oriented, one tends to be very musically oriented, and so again, you see that a kind of attempt to bifurcate, and then places like Goldsmith working hard to stitch them together. So you really had no programming experience before showing up there?
No, none whatsoever. No.
And so how did you get started? I mean, was it diving right into C++, or did you use something? Because Goldsmith, I know that they do a lot of stuff with things like C Sound and Max and PD. Did you play around with any of those intermediate tools?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we did the Music Computing 101 course was actually a Max MSP.
Okay.
And then you had the actual programming side, programming basics. It wasn't anything really like data structures and algorithms or anything like that. It was just really learning like what's an if statement, what's a for loop.
Right.
And that was actually in a language called processing, which is a Java library that's right. Like kind of watered down. Excellent language to learn if you're just getting started and you're creative and you want to build amazing things that people can see and hear. I think it's an awesome language to get started with. Yeah, I think especially you have Daniel Schiffman, who's on YouTube, who gives tutorials using processing. Daniel Schiffman was a very, very big inspiration to me in terms of my approach to teaching and helping others. So yes, processing and Max MSP.
Yeah, well, working off of Schiffman as an inspiration, that's a good starting point, because he's inspired an awful lot of people to get involved in coding. That's really cool. So why'd you end up in C++?
Well, it was, I knew from the start that C++ was the industry standard for developing these things, and that we also did study in our C++ in our second year. So we started off with C++, and they really just threw us in the deep end. We had a C++ course that we were taking, but I mean, as you know, it can be such a challenge to really get to know the language well enough to build anything of significance. Yeah, we did C++ in our second year, and I concentrated in that area, like from that point on, and with things like Juice, because I knew that it was the industry standard. And it was kind of interesting because Goldsmiths is very much an arts university, isn't it? So right, it's very much about, we aren't industry. We're going we're drawing outside of the lines. We're trying to think of things on the far reaches of, new ways of interfacing with music and with audio. And I felt in some ways that I was a little bit against the grain, because I came from a DJing background, so I had the industry experience. So I was really thinking about how can I get a job in this industry. I wasn't really thinking about how can I create sound art and things like that. I just thought, how can I create something that people want to use? And I knew that C++ was the way that people were doing it, and so I knew that that's where I needed to dive in.
Right. Interesting. Now, C++ is one thing. Juice is really another. That's almost like a discipline on top of C++, but it also provides a pretty interesting entry point for people who want to get into audio. When you got started, Juice hadn't been around for that long. What made you kind of identify it as a winner to be showing people?
I think it was really looking at job postings and seeing what places like Native Instruments, Focusrite, Ableton were really posting for their jobs. And also at the time, Juice was holding their Juice Summit and the Audio Developer, which became the Audio Developer Conference. And that was also held at Goldsmiths at the time. And so there was a lot of activity and that was happening around the university, seeing names like Rolly, Juice, and happening in Goldsmiths, and really wondering what that was about. They didn't teach us Juice at the university, but looking deeper into it, I saw that this was really one of the only cross-platform frameworks that you could use to really build VSTs and build audio apps. And it had all of these abstractions that made it quote unquote easy to build something quickly, even though it's not easy. It's not easy at all. But it was one of those things that I just really thought, what's the thing that's going to get me closest to building my own plugin? And Juice really seemed to be the answer for that, because you could compile different plugin formats and do it cross-platform just from one code base. I didn't even really have a good understanding of what that actually really meant at the time when I first started using it. But yeah.
Well, I think the cross-platform aspect of it is something that really draws people in, because when you start playing around with the differences in Windows versus Mac programming environments, they're pretty significant, and even like drawing routines and stuff like that are like mind-numbingly different. And so having a framework like Juice to sort of smooth the edges between the two seems to be pretty valuable. You mentioned that you had been doing some programming, but now you're kind of managing the audio programmer thing, but that you're also kind of still keeping your fingers in programming. What kind of program are you writing?
So I've actually been working on a DJ application for a couple years, and it's really interesting because right out of so one of my final projects for university was this machine learning DJ application, and there were two sides to it. One was that in DJing you have different scratch techniques, and there was this question of, well, can we identify what a scratch technique is using machine learning? Mm-hmm. So I got a prototype of that running, and then I also created a game. It's almost like Guitar Hero, but for DJs. And I started and I did that as a final project. Shortly after university was finished, I actually just put a very short video, maybe it was like 30 seconds, of the prototype of this application, which was kind of a patchwork thing between Max and Juice. And it went viral right away. It was really interesting because then one of the leading scratch DJs in the world got in touch with me, and they said, we want to do a showcase with this application. And so we actually ended up doing a showcase with Intel. So Intel brought us over, and we actually did two shows with Intel, in one in San Francisco and one in New York. That was absolutely huge. I mean, we had DJ setups that were set up throughout the venue, and people could come up and they could actually try out the application and try to and just try to learn scratching. So it was a pretty phenomenal experience for me, because it just felt like, here's this thing that I made in university, and now I'm in New York with Intel, and people are actually using this and enjoying this. And Yeah, it was really just a
Oh, that had to be a freak out. I just think of like the kind of projects I did when I was in school, even in grad school. I do these projects, but I knew underneath the covers it was kind of held together with band-aids and duct tape, right? I can't
yeah.
imagine hauling that and like plopping it in the middle of something that Intel's putting on. That had to be a little unnerving.
Yeah, it was. It was. And I got, once I was out of university, I got a little bit of help along the way to
Mm-hmm.
actually make it into something that people could actually use. So we ended up, like I was saying, it was originally kind of a Frankenstein of Max MSP and Juice. So we ended up porting it all over to Juice and C++. So that actually made it where other people could actually use it on their computers. And but it was a complete whirlwind. It was a complete whirlwind because I just thought, here's this thing that I made in university, and now the best scratching DJ in the world is actually using this on stage. And wow, what an incredible experience. And since then, I've been working on it mostly by myself. I work on it in my spare time, but I love it. I have such a deep passion for development and for coding and for learning. And I really feel like sometimes the business aspect of what we're doing at the Audio Programmer, it really kind of pulls more towards the paperwork, the meetings, these other things. But it's really that passion for learning that I think is really at the core of what we do. And that's why I enjoy teaching my son C++ as well, because I just enjoy, and I think more than anything, I mean, I can honestly say that over the past 3 years, that hundreds of people have come to me and told me that they've got opportunities and that they've actually got jobs from the tutorials that I gave back in from the channel. And that more than anything is really amazing, seeing people take my terrible C++ tutorial. I don't want to say terrible C++ tutorials, but I obviously I was just starting with C++ when I was creating the tutorials, and seeing people who have taken that little seed and they've grown it and they've taken it much further than I could have on my own, saying, people that work for some of the bigger companies in the world, Apple, Bose, all kinds of companies that say, oh yeah, but the way that I started off was with these tutorials. I mean,
Yeah.
what's better than that?
That's pretty cool. That's got to feel great. Now,
Yeah.
one of the things I'm curious about, C++ especially, is very much a formal. There's a lot of formalism to it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Both in the way that the code is structured, but even as you get into more and more, like quote modern C++, and certainly the Juice framework takes advantage of a lot of the modern C++ aspects. It also has a lot of formalization in the way that you define functions and the way that you define prototyping and the way that you deal with template parameters and all this kind of stuff. It's a little overwhelming, I think, sometimes to deal with the formalism, especially if you're coming from an art standpoint where what you're really trying to do is find a way to be experimental and to play around with things that maybe aren't available from commercial companies or aren't something that other people are either going to be aware of or going to pay much notice to. How do you tiptoe on the border between things being overly formal while still being able to be experimental?
Yeah, I think a lot of it just goes in your initial approach. Like I was saying before, I think in C++, especially, that there may be a culture of don't do things, and don't experiment things until you've learned the quote unquote right way to do it. So I'm very much a person that likes to build in iterations. So I always try to say to people, just try to start with something simple and try to work on that. Try to get something that, makes a sound before you try to create a full synthesizer. Mm-hmm. And I think that C++ still presents significant challenges to that ability to create anything of special significance without a significant amount of coding behind it. And that's where I think other tools like Max MSP and other ones like Super Collider and Sonic Pi really come in because they just allow the user to express some creativity and do it quite quickly, especially when you're starting off. I just wouldn't advise to try to start people off with C++ because I think a lot of people will just get frustrated because you're just thrown into the deep end right away. You're just thrown into straight engineering right away. Whereas I think when you start with, other tools like Max MSP, it gives you a chance to really say in 30 seconds, here's how you make a sound. You can get a sound up and running in like probably less than 30 seconds, probably 10 seconds. That is very fascinating, I think, to people because you want to really draw them in. You want to show them when you're teaching others, you really want to show people, like try to lower the threshold at the beginning to say, it is easy, it is possible, it is achievable. And I think that's really what we try to do with the audio programmer is that we really try to simplify things down in a lot of ways and say, well, because it's like an onion, isn't it? Like when it comes to C++ or when it comes to coding, you get this, the first stage is that you do something because somebody told you that that's the way that it's supposed to be done, but you don't inherently understand all the layers of why you need to inherit from this class or what inheritance actually is. You just know that that's the way to do it. But then eventually, as you gain experience, you start to peel off layers of that onion and you start to realize, oh, that's what inheritance is. And you start to get these epiphanies. And I think that's really what it's about. But it's really about trying to lower it enough where people don't get frustrated right away and they're able to create something and then give them the ability to stay in there, stay on the field of play so that they're able to continually have those epiphanies and continually learn those new things and have those new experiences.
Yeah, that's actually really interesting. I mean, you talk about like the old or the kind of like hard line, this is the way to do things. And I think that some of that is because a lot of the concepts of digital audio programming, happened 30 years ago when it was really unlikely to get a computer to make a sound at all. It was hard. You had to have highly, highly optimized code in order to even make it happen at all. Now you can, for like 5 cents, get a CPU that can run circles around what was used back then. And so some of the resource requirements are certainly lowered. But I think you bring up a great point too, which is that finding ways to sort of simultaneously learn C++, but also kind of the fundamentals of audio programming, to kind of do those things simultaneously is a great way of going and kind of growing into the craft. Something like Max MSP is definitely useful for learning about the fundamentals of computer audio, the fundamentals of the math behind audio and stuff like that. But I can see where getting into C++ really opens the doors for some interesting other experimentation. When you are introducing people into this stuff using the Juice framework, do you tend to have people move or have people make standalone applications, or is it easier to draw them into making plugins?
People really enjoy making plugins, and I think that's a great way to get people to interface into the actual industry. Is a lot of people really think of things, especially if they're doing C++, they're thinking of things in terms of plugins a lot of the times. When you start getting towards making standalone applications, I think there are a lot of other considerations that maybe the DAW is taking care of you, things like sound, what sound card are you running, input and output, things like that come into play that maybe add another layer of complexity into the mix. But a lot of the people that we speak to, they like to create plugins. I personally am not a big fan of plugins. I actually prefer the standalone application over plugins, but most people that we have in our community, they prefer to make plugins.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's a curious thing because the idea of making a standalone is cool because you can kind of control what your environment presents. But on the other hand, it is a little It's a little intense to all of a sudden have to start thinking about, oh, okay, I'm responsible for audio card selection. I'm responsible for, possibly hosting things like plugins and stuff like that. That gets to be, again, a little bit overwhelming. Now, tell me a little bit about sort of like the virtual aspects of what you're doing with the audio programmer. I mean, it looks from on your site, it looks like you actually, in addition to doing your videos, you have a course that's available for people to learn kind of in a more formal situation or formal way to learn programming. What's the difference between what you're doing on YouTube and what's in the course?
I think the big difference is just structure mainly. When we did the course, so I did the course as a collaboration with another developer out of France named Ivan Cohen, who's a leading DSP developer. And one of the questions that I think people had is, okay, now I've done the tutorials through the YouTube channel. How do we take things to the next level, and what are the best practices for actually creating a plugin? So you have this next level that happens that goes from, okay, we've hacked something together. We've created something that makes sound or does a delay. Now, how do we do it this quote unquote right way, the industry way, where we're actually going to, talk about thread synchronization and, using atomics instead of just using regular variables, and thinking about the things that the music tech companies think about when they're creating plugins and they're creating their products. I mean, this is all, I would say, when it comes to the audio programmer, the biggest thing that we do is we really think about how can people make a living from this? Like, I think other people, they really come from maybe an artistic or from maybe like a scholarly perspective where they're thinking of making sound art or, thinking of things in a creative way. I think for me, maybe because it was just my angle, I really thought about how can I teach somebody where when they watch these tutorials, they can actually go out and they can eventually make this into a job, make this into a way where they can actually put a roof over their head and make a living from coding. And I say that because I spent so much time as a DJ, as kind of an artist in a way. And I used to, when I was touring, sometimes I'd tour in third world countries, places like Kenya. I remember going through the streets of Nairobi and seeing the poverty there. And there was part of me that felt like, with music, we were able to definitely provide hope and provide a place, a mutual kind of language that is understood around the world. But I thought, I always felt like I want to be something like a doctor or somebody that can like actually really like go in and actually like change somebody's life in a very tangible, in a very tangible way. And that's really where like the ethos of the audio programmer is. I really thought of it like I really want people to come away from this and come away from these tutorials and feel like now they have the power or the springboard to actually go get an actual job or actually create their own plugin company where they're actually able to sell their own products. I mean, what's better than that? Seeing somebody get opportunities from a little seed that you planted. I mean, to me, that's one of the best feelings in the world.
Right on. Yeah. That's cool. Well, and that really ties into sort of the way that you're expanding the community through the audio programmer too, doing meetups, doing that Discord server, stuff like that. How has that allowed you to sort of like connect with the world of developers and wannabe developers?
Well, I think one thing that's been very helpful is that the community and the ecosystem of our community is very helpful and really supportive of each other. And I think that maybe what's happened in the past is that developers have gone into forums and we've seen them throughout the net in the past where maybe they weren't the most welcoming, or maybe they were a little bit condescending in the way that they treat newcomers. And one of the cores of what we wanted to do with the audio programmer is that I wanted it to be a place that no matter what level you were at, even if you weren't coding, even if you hadn't written your first line of code, you could come here and you would feel welcome, and you would feel like no question is too dumb to ask. You could ask anything. You can ask how to download the Juice framework. You could ask, how to download Max MSP, and that somebody would be able to answer and do it in a non-condescending way. And so really what I have to do is I have to really commend the community at large for the way that they support each other and the way that we're able to create a sense of belonging. And that's really what's at the core, is that, and what attracts other people is that, there's a certain magic there that of belonging and of welcoming, where people who come in, I think a lot of times are taken aback by, wow, this is a really welcoming community. Some people have told me that, they've never really quite seen a community like the one that we have. But, it's not a one-person show, though. It's not just me. It's other people. It's the people who are in our Discord each and every day, and people who interface with us that really make it possible.
Right on. That's so cool. Well, unfortunately, our time is up, but just one question before we go. I'm just curious. I know that you talked a lot about kind of growing up and going to being in the U.S. Air Force and stuff like this. You are now based out of London, right?
Yeah, that's right. I live right outside of London. That's correct.
What caused you to decide to land there?
It was actually the Air Force. I was stationed here. I was stationed here in England with the Air Force. Then once my contract was up, I thought, I could just go back to my small town in Pennsylvania or go back to the U.S. Mm-hmm. But there are so many things out in the world to go and see and experience. And I just thought, if I go back to the U.S., I think when you're in the U.S., it can be quite difficult to get out of the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas being in London, you really have Paris, which is just a couple hours of train ride. You really have Berlin, that's only an hour and a half, 2 hours by plane. And it is really that excites me. The different cultures, the opportunity to see things that most of the other people who I grew up with in the States have never had the opportunity to experience.
Right.
So that's really what it is. It's the culture that really keeps me staying over here. But I do miss it in the States. Yeah.
Well, Josh, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to have this chat. It was really great. And but with that, I'm going to let you go and have the rest of your day. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Darwin.
All right. Many thanks to Joshua for the great chat. It was really cool to get in touch with him, get caught up with what he's doing and where he's coming from. If you have a chance, get over to theaudioprogrammer.com and check out the work that he's been doing. It's pretty fabulous, especially if you're really wanting to get into Juice C++ work. But he's got other stuff cooking as well, so it's really worth taking a look at. Thanks so much for continuing to listen and for passing this along to your friends, family, and acquaintances. I really do appreciate it. We're going to want to do a little bit of a subscription push here pretty soon just to try and get a few more people on board. So if you have an opportunity to reach out and let people know about the podcast, please do so. Other than that, I want to thank you so much for listening. We'll catch you next time around. Bye now.